Now that we've seen the structure and the original meaning of Genesis chapter 4 verse 1 through chapter 6 verse 8, we should turn to our final topic, modern application. How does the New Testament teach us to apply this portion of Moses' primeval history to our modern lives? In our usual fashion, we will explore how the New Testament elaborates on these themes in terms of the three stages of Christ's kingdom. First, the inauguration of the kingdom, which took place when Christ first came to this earth. Second, the continuation of the kingdom, which extends throughout the history of the church. And third, the consummation of the kingdom, when Christ returns in glory and brings the new heavens and new earth. These three phases of Christ's kingdom should be explored separately to reach a fuller understanding of the ways violence and deliverance apply to Christians today. Let's look first at the motifs of violence and hope of deliverance in the inauguration of the kingdom. The inauguration of the kingdom in Christ's first coming recalls the world of violence in the primeval history in at least two ways. First, we see connections with the violence Jesus suffered while on earth. And second, we find connections with the deliverance which Jesus brought to his people. Let's look first at the suffering Jesus experienced in his first coming. Anyone familiar with the life of Jesus knows that Jesus suffered persecution from the world in many ways. As he ministered to the downtrodden, he bore their grief and pain. Yet there can be no doubt that according to the New Testament, the climax of violence perpetrated against Christ was his death on the cross. By suffering one of the worst forms of execution known in his day, Jesus actually experienced a fate worse than that suffered by the righteous in primeval times. In this light, it's not surprising that one way the New Testament describes the suffering of Jesus is to compare his death on the cross to the violence of the primeval world, or to be more specific, to the death of Abel. The writer of Hebrews knew that Christ had suffered innocently at the hands of wicked men, and for this reason he compared Christ's death to Abel's death in chapter 12, verses 23 and 24 of his epistle. You have come to God, the judge of all men, to the spirits of righteous men made perfect, to Jesus, the mediator of a new covenant, and to the sprinkled blood that speaks a better word than the blood of Abel. The allusion here to Moses' primeval history is clear. Christ's shed blood spoke a better or greater word than the blood of Abel. That is to say, Christ's death was even more significant in the eyes of God than the death of Abel was. Jesus' death was no ordinary event. His death atoned for the sins of his people because he suffered in the place of everyone who believes in him. But beyond this, Christ's death stirred the just wrath of God more greatly than had the blood of Abel. In this light, when we read Moses' account of the violence of the primeval history, we should not simply take note of why Moses wrote these chapters for his original Israelite readers. From the New Testament perspective, we should also see that the violence inflicted on the righteous in the primeval history anticipated the suffering of Christ in the inauguration of the kingdom. Now that we've seen how the New Testament draws connections between the primeval world of violence and Christ's suffering, we should turn to a second way in which the inauguration of the kingdom touches this portion of Genesis. A significant link also occurs in the hope of deliverance Jesus brought to the world. Jesus spent most of his public ministry proclaiming a message of hope, the gospel. The message that one day the suffering of life would be over for those who followed him. Jesus' devotion to this gospel message appears throughout his teachings, but consider how prominent the message of deliverance appears in the Beatitudes, the opening statements of blessing in the Sermon on the Mount. As Jesus began this well-known sermon, he said these words in Matthew chapter 5, verses 10 through 12. Blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when people insult you, persecute you, and falsely say all kinds of evil against you because of me. Rejoice and be glad, because great is your reward in heaven. These Beatitudes reveal that one of the central concerns of Jesus' teaching ministry was to bring the hopeful message that God had not deserted his people. Jesus encouraged his followers to have hope that God would one day deliver them from all suffering. But Jesus did not simply teach the good news of hope for deliverance. Through his death and resurrection, he actually accomplished the deliverance which he announced. Because Jesus was the perfect Son of David, his death made atonement for the sins of God's people. His death paid the price for sin so that his followers would no longer have to fear the terror of death. As we read in Hebrews chapter 2, verses 14 and 15, Jesus died so that by his death he might destroy him who holds the power of death, that is, the devil, and free those who all their lives were held in slavery by their fear of death. So we see that the themes of violence and hope of deliverance readily apply to the inauguration of the kingdom in Christ. As Moses wrote to acknowledge the threats against Israel and to teach Israel about the power of God to deliver, the New Testament reveals that Christ came to suffer violence and to bring deliverance for his people from the power of wickedness in the world.